Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining for the sixth of our series of webinars we'll be hosting at Bringer Partners in 2021, covering key themes and topics that will define a low carbon future, featuring experts from Bringer and our clients. My name is Ilash Patel, and I am the Global Strategy and Markets Lead for our energy and resources industry here at Bringer Partners, and I'm delighted to be hosting this series of webinars. Our low carbon future is here now, and 2021 is the inflection point. One need look no further than the fresh government commitments from the top emitting countries, the imminent approach of COP26, and a private sector focus on embedding climate change into investment decisions. 2021 will be the year of climate action. This may be an optimistic view, which perhaps only I hold, but it also comes with a warning. Our generation will be the first to feel the full effects of climate change and the last to be able to do anything about it. So 2021 is the year, in my view, when transition must become transformation, where we must deliver on the promises and commitments that we have made to a low carbon future. In that context today, and I'm really excited, we'll be focusing on offshore wind, large-scale renewables, and how the future may be multi-purpose projects and renewable energy zones. And I'm really excited by this topic because I think this is a key area for unlocking our low carbon future. Our industry, with government and consumer support, have made remarkable progress in delivering the global installed offshore wind in operation today, some 30 gigawatts. The scale of the challenge, though, to deliver the ambition of 100 gigawatts and beyond should not be underestimated. And we know global renewables are going to be the bedrock of a low carbon future. And in onshore wind and solar, there will need to be a focus on scale, route to market, project innovation. In offshore wind, markets have been incubated in Europe and now have gone global. And Asia, North America, Australia, indeed, will be key markets with specific focus. And with that comes an obligation, reducing the cost of the grid network required to bring the offshore wind power to customers through coordinating offshore grid connections. And indeed on onshore renewables, particularly large-scale onshore renewables, both in Australia, as we'll talk about today, but as well as in Northern Europe, where large-scale projects located further away from demand need to be brought to where the demand centres are. And that, again, will require large-scale grid infrastructure. So in that context, multi-purpose projects and renewable energy zones will be critical to driving down costs and scaling ambitions through coordinating and reducing transmission costs, reducing risks, increasing resilience, and adding new technologies to deliver other energy vectors. To explore this issue today, I have with me Matthew Grant, who is Bringer's key expert in transmission regulation and offshore transmission networks. Previously, Matt spent a number of years at Ofgem designing the cap and floor regime, and I've had the pleasure of working with Mark over the last 5 years on everything from offshore networks to interconnection. And Jackie Fennick, sitting in our Sydney office today. Jackie, welcome, one of our experts in Australia and Southeast Asia, also a policy expert, and spent much time with the Australian government and regulators working on transmission and regulation issues. So I'm absolutely delighted Matt and Jackie are here today with us. They'll be covering topics including how our European policymakers and developers continue to explore opportunities for coordinated offshore networks and multi-purpose projects. How's that going to help to maximise renewable build-out and meet internal and cross-border network needs? How big are the opportunities and challenges? Could coordinated offshore networks provide a solution to meet our ambitions around decarbonisation targets? And what can we learn from Australia's approach to coordinated infrastructure planning through renewable energy zones? And before I hand you over to Matt and Jackie, I'd like to thank you again for joining. Encourage you to make this an interactive session by posting questions in the chat. And by all means, please raise your virtual hand if you'd like to ask a question outside of the chat. I'll aim to monitor both of those channels and draw you into the discussion during the webinar. Please don't be hesitant in doing so. The more interactive this webinar is, the better it'll be. So with that, Matt and Jackie, I'm delighted to be able to hand over to you to take us through your assessment of renewable energy zones and multi-purpose projects.
Thank you, Ilash. Some weighty topics, and I think we're excited to talk some of those through with you today. So in terms of the kind of structure of the session we have this morning, I'm going to kick off, talk us through some of the kind of the key concepts. So what do we mean by multi-purpose projects? A bit of a recap of progress across Europe so far. So where have successes been made, and what have we got left to do? And then a bit of a focus on some of the development challenges. So as Alesh said, these are highly complex projects, and particularly in those we're facing in Europe. There are lots of benefits, but also there are lots of challenges. And as we know as an industry, there are lots of different parties who are working hard to try and resolve those challenges, from governments, regulators, the system operator, through to project developers on all sides. We'll then pass across to Jackie, and Jackie will give us a bit of a case study looking at the Australian experience, and particularly looking at renewable energy zones and the overlap or the interlinks between the way we're thinking about offshore coordinated generation and transmission in Europe, and how that compares to the renewable energy zone concept in Australia. Again, thinking about planning, generation and transmission to deliver the kind of scale of renewables that we are seeing globally. So to start with then, I suppose it's just a bit of a recap about, what are we talking about here? And this is focused on Europe. But when we talk about multi-purpose projects, what we mean is the combination of different infrastructure types, particularly looking at interconnection, offshore wind and onshore bootstrapable reinforcements. So on the interconnector side first, interconnectors are very much a hot topic in Europe, and even more so maybe now with GB, given where we are with the trade and cooperation agreement and the challenges that presents for both existing and potential projects. But in a nutshell, these are multi-billion euro cross-border infrastructure assets that allow power to flow between two markets or two networks, following economic signals, driving competition with power flowing from low to high price across Europe. We have a number of these projects already, connecting our markets to our neighbours, and I think I see some colleagues from Ofgem and BEIS who will be very familiar with the kind of frameworks and regulation around these. I suppose that's one of the pillars of multi-purpose projects, is facilitating our net zero ambition by providing the flexibility or offering flexibility through cross-border infrastructure to help us meet these renewable targets that we have both in the UK and GB and across Europe. The second, I suppose, pillar of multi-purpose projects is offshore wind. So we know there are some ambitious targets now for 2030, looking at 40 gigawatts of offshore wind in the UK. The generation position is relatively clear in the sense there's a strong target there. The networks that connect up offshore wind farms, which are offshore connections or OFTOs, are delivered through competitive tender run by Ofgem, which was a policy position put in place back in 2009, which was looking at a change in the way that we think about connections for offshore networks. And this is very much kind of a real theme of what the current, bringing right up to today, some of the real interesting thinking around how we take that further away from the kind of radial point-to-point connections that we've seen historically to a more coordinated network. If you bring those concepts together, you get these hybrid multi-purpose projects that I've put a kind of stylized version of here. But these projects, in a way, can cover a whole range of things. It's the ability to bring together different infrastructure types to deliver those combined benefits of offshore wind interconnection and also onshore reinforcement. It's an interesting concept about the extent to which offshore networks can be used to deliver onshore benefits, so using connections between wind farms, which is a concept that Ofgem have thought about historically through offshore coordination policy, to help deliver onshore network reinforcements to the benefits of the onshore system, so alleviating constraints, working around constraints by using the networks that are being developed offshore. So this is kind of the framework, this is what we're talking about. I suppose a couple of headlines of relevant pieces of policy or ongoing policy that are worth mentioning. The first is maybe obviously the white paper and the commitments around offshore wind for 2030, which, as I said before, are kind of a big kind of marker in terms of the ambition for UK offshore wind by 2030, which is a significant increase in where we are today and is a real challenge for our industry. Together with a kind of looser target or ambition around interconnection, so looking at 18 gigawatts by 2030 again, that was a position put out in the white paper. That represents a threefold increase from the current level of capacity, noting there are a number of projects in the pipeline. But again, this is looking at a significant shift in the way that we're building infrastructure, particularly in kind of the North Sea, but also in our connecting markets. Alongside this, it goes without saying that there's Ofgem BEIS, the ESO are thinking about these issues as we speak. So there's a significant body of work looking at the role of offshore transmission networks as part of the OTNR, the Transmission Network Review, which are considering many of the questions that we're talking about today. So I suppose it's good to have some of our colleagues from Ofgem and BEIS on the call, and please do jump in with thoughts. It's fair to say that this is an ongoing discussion. It's been a discussion for around 10 years, but we're looking forward to seeing some of the kind of the short-term solutions that might come forward from the review. And then finally, I suppose, sadly, we have to talk about the trade agreement and the challenges that presents for these types of projects. So obviously, these projects have elements of cross-border cross-border infrastructure. So that brings into play the kind of the interplay between GB and our kind of UK European regulation, asset definition, legal definitions. And it is fair to say that the trade agreement has added some additional complexity to what were already relatively complex projects that are causing challenges for policymakers and developers. So that's a bit of the kind of context. What are we talking about? I won't spend a long time on this slide, but I suppose it's really just to bring out that these are not new topics. These are not new discussion points. We in Europe, but particularly in the UK, we've been thinking about multi-purpose projects, hybrid projects for a number of years. And actually, since I started in the industry over 10 years ago, this has been a kind of common theme of up and down in terms of the kind of the emphasis on this type of engagement. Going back right to the kind of the OFTO regime developed back in 2009, 2010, there was a lot of work done at the time looking at the role of offshore coordinated networks. So how can some of these questions around using the OFTO regime and connecting wind farms together, not just radially, can bring significant benefits. And that was a policy position that Ofgem took forward and provided some real thoughts on back in the kind of the early 2013 to 2015. That was then followed by a number of different policy initiatives looking at the role of network planning and coordination, which is a real theme that we'll come on to later from the Australian example, where thinking about the coordinated role of generation and transmission planning and how that can help to deliver a kind of a better solution overall. On the European side, there's also been a number of studies. So I haven't covered them all here, so I'm not missing anyone out, but I suppose just a couple to draw your attention to is back in 2010, some of the North Seas countries offshore grid initiative, which is a really kind of fundamental thought piece around the North Sea, the kind of 10 member states around the North Sea, looking at the opportunities for coordination in the North Sea. In a more kind of localized sense, there were studies looking at Scottish Island coordination. So how can we coordinate generation and transmission from an onshore perspective on Scottish Islands with connections back to the mainland? We've seen some big success stories. So the Kriegers Flak project, which is a combined kind of offshore wind and interconnection solution between Denmark and Germany, provides a great example of how you can deliver these coordinated projects successfully. And that is a project that is now, live and is going well. And it shows that there is a route through this complex regulatory, economic, legal minefield, but actually it does take a lot of work, and this project's been in development for a long time. And then I suppose looking forward, we've got a policy review on the offshore transmission network review, which is ongoing. We've got Ofgem are due to consult on the future of the cap and floor regime, so the future of interconnection regulation. And we've got the targets for offshore wind. So together, these projects, these policies provide a real focus on offshore networks. And if you combine that with our net zero ambition and the plan to 2030 and 2050, it really does show that these projects could have a significant benefit in helping us drive those decarbonisation targets by 2030 and 2050. That brings us on to, I suppose, some of the challenges and some of the big questions that many of you will be familiar with, but I'll maybe run through a couple of the headlines here, just to give us a flavour of some of the issues that we're tackling as an industry to think through how to develop these projects successfully. So I suppose from a legal and regulatory sense, one of the big issues for these types of multi-purpose projects is the fact that they combine different asset definitions, different regulatory mechanisms, and different legal treatments, which, whilst I think we could agree that everyone thinks is a great idea, and from a top-down policy or delivery perspective, there are many benefits, the bottom-up challenges of trying to combine infrastructure definitions is problematic. It stems from a situation where projects have been thought about in isolation. So offshore networks are designed to connect offshore wind, but actually, how can that regime be stretched to develop kind of coordinated infrastructure or connect into an interconnector to provide multiple benefits? And this is something that is a bit of a barrier, but I suppose there's a question about how high that barrier really is. And it comes down to the extent to which these definitions can be stretched and can be used in a way that is maybe not as they were intended, but still delivers the same kind of consumer protections, kind of economic regulation and economic returns and revenues for project developers. A key theme in that around the regulatory arrangements are anticipatory investment. So this is a concept that is been considered many times across the offshore network review over the last 10 years effectively, which is saying how do you incentivize and remunerate parties for investing now ahead of need on the expectation of future connections. And that could be, building an OFTO that is slightly bigger to account for a potential future interconnection connection in future. But obviously that comes with some time delays and some economic challenges around how you incentivize the parties to take that risk and pass that risk on to consumers ultimately, and build a project to develop a future need. And this is a common theme across all of these multi-purpose projects, is the concept of anticipatory investment, and one that we'll come back to when we think about the Australian example a bit further. On the revenue side, it goes without saying that interconnectors in particular have some particular kind of uncertainties around revenue. So revenues from cross-border trade are derived from power flows between market prices, so between markets based on their price fundamentals. So there's some inherent uncertainty to the value and the revenue from those projects. Now, obviously, we can model those and we can think about those as a projection of future prices, and that derives an expected revenue stream. But they do still have some inherent uncertainty. Now, Ofgem have taken some steps as part of the cap and floor regime that Alesh mentioned to try and transfer some of that risk back from interconnected developers through to consumers, which has been a great success. And we've seen a number of projects, a whole range of projects come forward in Ofgem's cap and floor windows 1 and 2. But it's fair to say, as we move closer to the point where we reach the marginal kind of benefit from an additional interconnector, and particularly with multi-purpose projects, which add the dynamics of an offshore wind farm connection as well, it provides some real additional challenges for how those revenues can be guaranteed to provide a kind of financeable and investable revenue stream for project developers. Another challenge here from an offshore wind perspective is the role of subsidies. So offshore wind in the UK is subject to CFDs, and the kind of eligibility of CFDs for multi-purpose projects is a question that is being considered at length at the moment. So in simple terms, if you're connected through a wind farm is connected via an interconnector, does that have an impact on the eligibility of CFDs, and does it have an impact on the bankability of that offshore wind farm? The similar questions arise if you think about OFTO connections, but at least there is some precedent as to how OFTOs are connected and remunerated through the CFD. Financeability we've touched on already, but I suppose a point to pull out here is, I suppose, the procurement and development risk associated with these, what are effectively first-of-a-kind projects. So I mentioned the Kriegers Flak project in Europe, and that's a great example of TSOs working together, so national incumbent transmission system operators working together to develop a coordinated infrastructure solution. When you introduce the kind of developer-led elements of kind of UK regulation, that does add some complexities, particularly if project developers are taking some of their project and development risk, particularly upfront, in terms of designing the solution and designing the kind of offshore coordinated elements. So procurement and development risk, I think, is a big challenge for these projects, because these are, as I said, if you have a multi-billion-pound interconnector with a many hundreds of pounds OFTO and add some offshore wind, you've quite quickly got a very, very high value project, or at least in terms of capital costs, a very expensive project to build and develop. On the governance side, I think that this is where we get in some interesting questions around the overall plan and development plan for offshore grids. So at the moment, we've had a very much kind of developer-led approach to interconnection, which has been a proactive decision from Ofgem to leave the kind of the investment decisions to project developers, where to build, how big to build, which countries to connect to. That drives an incentive to get it right, and I think that's been a successful delivery mechanism so far. I think across all of this infrastructure, and multi-purpose projects really bring this to light, is do we need a bit more of a plan around how the North Sea or how the offshore grid should develop? Now, this is a theme that's been picked up many times. So some of the early work looking at North Sea offshore grids, the Friends of the Supergrid or Sustainable Grid have looked at this many times. And there's been lots of kind of big questions around, what is the role of different parties offshore? Should there be a kind of top-down system plan for offshore networks? ENTSO-E, from a pan-European perspective, do consider some of this from a top-down planning perspective, but that's not a binding plan. That's a project-level plan where projects are brought together through a kind of CBA and benefit methodology. But I suppose when we're thinking about governance, we have to think about the the potential role for an offshore planner and the role for coordinating generation and transmission, but also the role for redistribution of value. Because when we start thinking about benefits accruing to different parties, who should pay for this? If you've got a connection between two member states and there are benefits to both sides, they may not be equal. And there's been lots of work to try and think about how we combine the kind of the methodology or the process to for these projects to make sure that it's a fair distribution of value and welfare and revenue across different member states or jurisdictions to really pave the way for these projects going forward. I think I'll pause there for a second, just to kind of let that sink in. I would reference the kind of the Australian work that we're going to talk about in a moment, because I think that does really bring to light how some of the coordination of generation transmission can really help to deliver, or at least some of those questions are starting to deliver and think about some of the challenges around coordinated networks in Australia.
I think that's great, Matt. That's an excellent overview of the issues across legals, anticipatory investment, revenues. I'd love to get your thoughts on, these issues have been examined for about 9 years, maybe even 10. I remember leading the first Baringa study for Bays and Ofgem on offshore coordination in 2011. I then led another study, which I think you were involved with, but colleagues within Baringa were in 2015 for Scottish Isles. There's been at least two big European studies that I'm aware of, one of which we were involved with. What's your sense of, has the debate and solution design moved on sufficiently from those debates, or are we going a little bit round and round in circles?
Yeah, so I think what I would say is that I think the ambition has accelerated. So I think now we're in a position where, going back to those points those milestones you referred to, Alesh, there's certainly some intent and some goodwill, but it maybe wasn't consistent or coordinated. So I think what is positive is that we're seeing a much more coordinated and consistent plan, or at least a view that these projects are likely to deliver benefits from developers through to national regulators and governments through to European-wide. The Commission and ACER have all expressed an ambition that these projects are potentially going to provide a real value in terms of that flexibility and the renewable connections. I think you're getting to a good point, which is from the detail, some of the kind of bottom-up challenges that maybe I'm referring to on this slide, some of those questions really haven't been answered. And I think that's partly because there hasn't been that real force of kind of the industry getting behind it. And actually, because we now are in a situation where there are a lot of people thinking about this, from developers to governments to regulators, we've got a real opportunity to try and solve some of those thorny, what you might call kind of administrative issues around asset definition, which sounds dull, but ultimately is going to determine whether these projects can go ahead. And I think that's where there is a real focus on finding the right solution, because, and actually not forgetting the work that's been done. So, referring back to some of those studies and some of the early work done on offshore coordination, a lot of these issues were thought about in lots of detail, and lots of kind of good work that's been done to try and define what some of the solutions might look like. But I think it is now a kind of a bit of a tipping point where the short term, to get some of these projects away in the short term, this is something that Ofgem and Bays and the ESO have considered and are taking into account. There need to be some kind of short term pathways to make these projects, to get these projects realised. So I think there has been learning, and it is all additive. It's building on previous works. But I would really say that now it's the kind of the ambition is coordinated and more consistent, which may be subject to the TCA and Brexit causing us a few challenges in the more immediate term, be a bit of a catalyst for moving this forward.
Yeah, just one follow-up, if you don't mind, Matt. I think my sense of it is that it has been for a few years now that developers and investors need to take a stronger lead on this out of self-interest, i.e., in a world where competitive auctions for renewables, particularly offshore wind, are driving down prices and costs therefore need to come down, it would be in developers' self-interest to coordinate transmission, both amongst their own projects and amongst projects of other developers, if you see what I mean. Yeah. So it's kind of, and are you seeing in the developer investor community a bigger push to make this happen, and government kind of playing, or regulators playing a kind of facilitating role rather than driving role, or a developers investor still waiting for government and regulators to provide an answer to them?
I think it is exactly we're faced with both is happening. So we are seeing developers are pushing government, and government are as I said, they're reviewing this in detail as part of the OT&R review. I think there is a bit of a chicken and egg. What comes first? Is it the idea or is it the solution? And actually, I think at the moment we're in a bit of a position where it's on project developers to put forward opportunities or solutions, and government and regulators and the ESO are thinking through how those could materialise in practice for short-term, medium-term, and kind of enduring solutions. So I think it's on all parties. I think all ideas are good ideas effectively at the moment. I think it's a case where there's not a particularly simple route through all of this. So it's the kind of the emphasis on all parties to come forward with propositions. It's great to say that government regulators have been accommodating of that and taking forward lots of kind of stakeholder engagements to take that into account. Because I think it is recognising that there's not an obvious solution to all of this. It might be that you put in place a whole new regulatory licensing subsidy framework for these specific asset classes. But as we know, that's not a short-term fix. That's a kind of 2030 and beyond fix. And actually, getting us to 2030 is really the ambition. Is getting the projects developed in the kind of timeframe between now and then, which are really going to help drive that step change to kind of 2030 and the decarbonisation by 2050.
Great. Thanks, Matt. I know we've got plenty to get through. Should we keep going?
Yeah, I'll maybe just summarise. I think we've talked about this slide already to some extent, and I think you were picking up on these points around the benefits, Alesh, which are, why are these projects beneficial? And the reasons are kind of obvious in some ways. Cost savings from reducing the total amount of capex you actually need to build by sharing infrastructure. Efficiently using infrastructure that would otherwise be underutilized. Load factors on offshore wind are high, but they're not using the full capacity of cables. Increasing cross-border trade. We know there's been lots of studies, and there continue to be studies around the benefits of cross-border trade in general, and the competition and security supply benefits. So providing a route to facilitate additional cross-border interconnection is beneficial to an extent. So there's a point where that becomes more marginal, but I think the main studies suggest we're certainly not there yet. And then the obvious one is renewable integration and decarbonisation. That there are the benefits of facilitating flexibility from cross-border connections, and combining that with offshore wind does help us meet those kind of lofty targets that we know around 2030 and 2050. And I suppose the final point for me is it's an exciting time, right? There's a lot going on. That the kind of the different paths are converging in the sense that the policymakers, the developers, the top-down institutions are all thinking about these same issues. We're seeing continued support from kind of the European Commission. Our role in Europe obviously is changing, and that we are exploring as the UK exploring our future relationship. But I suppose the top-down ambition from the European perspective is certainly commendable, and something we need to kind of grab hold of if we're going to drive these projects forward, because particularly on the cross-border nature, we can't do it alone. The clean energy package, similarly, kind of supporting the role of hybrids, but more detail to follow. I've talked about Ofgem Basin, the ESO, and the Offshore Transmission Network Review, and then individual projects driving forward solutions and opportunities, and finding kind of the mandate and the investment case for these projects. So some positive news, some positive ambition, but clearly lots more to do. I'll pause there for a moment before we pass on to Jackie to maybe give us a little bit of the Australian context, because I think, as I said at the start, it's quite interesting to do a bit of a comparison with how networks are being developed. That's both transmission network and generation build on top of that to kind of meet renewable targets. And the Australian example, particularly about renewable energy zones, which are not offshore but onshore, provide a really interesting kind of counterpoint to how the planning and the kind of considerations are being taken forward in other jurisdictions. So I will pause there for a second and then pass over to Jackie to take us through our Australian case study.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Alesh, and good morning and good evening to everyone that's joining us today, depending on which time zone you're in. So I'm going to start with a little bit of context setting. For those who are in Australia, apologies if this is sort of covering old material, but I think it's useful just to provide a bit of context for everybody else. So in a nutshell, Australia has come from and continues to be a very coal-dominated energy market. This is the national electricity market that I'm talking about, which runs down the east and across the south of Australia. It doesn't include the west or north. So we've come from a very coal-dominated market with some gas and some hydro. And what this has meant is that the transmission backbone for Australia really runs along the coast, basically, to connect the coal generators, which I've marked kind of indicatively here with black triangles, with the load centres, which are predominantly around the coast as well. They're the pink dots. And the sort of solid transmission backbone has always run along the coast like that to connect the supply to the load. And if we move on to the next slide, this is something that is going to need to change, and it's going to need to change very quickly. So where we're going, and I will just quickly note that the timeframes in these two charts are different. So it is a very rapid transition. It's not as rapid as it perhaps looks with those two charts side by side. The second is a 30-year strip, and the first is a 14-year strip. But in any case, we're looking at a very rapid transition away from coal to a system that's dominated by predominantly wind and solar. And the solar there is both rooftop solar, which is the darker orange color, and then utility scale solar, which is the yellow color. And what the map to the left shows is essentially the shift in locations of the supply of electricity across the NEM, the electricity market. So we're really moving from a system that had a small number of very large coal generators and a couple of large hydro and gas generators that were located relatively close to the load centres, to a system that is far more geographically diverse. And a lot of the very strong solar and wind resources, and particularly the resources that are quite accessible in terms of land availability, are located further inland, basically, than the existing transmission line really extends. So from a transmission perspective, I guess what we're looking at is a system where we really need to extend the transmission network into regions that have very sparse transmission at the moment, and in areas that do have transmission, that needs to be built out to handle the capacity of new solar and wind that will be coming online. I think relevant to note at this point that you won't see any offshore wind around this coastline at this stage. It's definitely something that some of the state governments are looking into at the moment, but at this stage we don't have any offshore resources in this electricity market. However, I think there are actually a lot of crossovers with what Matt's just talked us through in terms of offshore wind, because some of these renewable energy zones, so some of these areas that are further inland are currently with very little or no transmission capacity. So they're areas basically where we're looking to build out a lot of wind or solar, and we'll need to extend sort of greenfield transmission network out to reach them, which I think actually has a lot of similarities to trying to develop new network out to offshore wind sites. So I think we can probably move on to the next slide. I think actually, just before I go into this, perhaps one more point on the previous slide. An interesting sort of difference between the European examples and the Australian example is to note actually that one of the key drivers of this transition is not federal government policy. We actually have very little ambition at the federal level to transition to renewable energy. Some of the state governments have quite strong ambitions, but one of the key drivers is actually that many of these coal power plants are nearing the end of their lifespan. They're becoming less reliable, and we've got retirements on the horizon over the next couple of decades. And that's the key driver here, with coal no longer being economic relative to wind and solar when it comes to new builds. So we'll see the coal exiting through retirements, and then that capacity will need to be replaced by wind and solar. Yep. So given this situation where we're seeing a dramatic shift in the type of generation that we need in the system, and also a dramatic shift in where it needs to be located, and a whole of system sort of transformation that will be needed in order to facilitate that. In the last couple of years, we've shifted to a central planning approach for some of the network and generation coordination across the market. So I think it was 2018, the first integrated system plan was published. The energy market operator here, AMO, published this plan based on quite detailed cost-benefit analysis and scenario modelling to develop what they've called an optimal development path, which is for the whole energy market over a 20-year horizon. And it identifies the key sort of very major network upgrades that will be needed based on sort of assumptions or assessments of where the majority of the new generation in the system will be built out to deliver a least cost solution going forward to meeting all of our supply needs. And I think the move to central planning has been quite an interesting and important one for Australia. And it's interesting to note, and this is something that I'll then get into in the next few slides, that renewable energy zones are a really key part of that optimal least cost development pathway for the energy market in Australia. So AMO has identified a large number of renewable energy zones, which are the patches that are kind of a light green color in this chart. And they're areas with very strong solar and wind resources predominantly, and the potential to be built out to supply large quantities of electricity. And renewable energy zones have also become a really core part of state government energy policy and planning across almost all of the states. And then if we can move on to the next slide. Great, thank you. So renewable energy zones are coordinated assets. They're essentially these zones that will have a shared transmission network, basically, to facilitate the sort of needs of a large number of different generators and to supply that electricity back to load. In terms of the benefits of renewable energy zones, I think the most important benefit to note is actually that with the scale of new generation that's needed to be built in this market over the next few decades, it actually won't happen, I think I could safely say, without this coordinated network investment. Whereas in other markets, and it sounds like in the UK with offshore wind, you see a developer-led approach. Here in the NEM, that's not something that we're really seeing very widely, and I think certainly not something that the energy market as a whole would look to depend on for meeting our future needs. And some of the key differences that I think are driving this sort of lack of developer-led renewable energy zone infrastructure or lack of developer-led point-to-point infrastructure are just that the scale of the generation that's being built is smaller than what you would see in offshore wind. We're certainly moving to a larger scale increasingly, but at this stage projects would be in the hundreds of megawatts. And so the economics of building a very long transmission line back to the central sort of backbone of transmission are quite different. The way that the market is run and the way that network connections are run here, we have an open access scheme, and connecting assets don't pay deep connection charges. They only pay the shallow connection costs. So you would essentially be weighing up the costs of building a long transmission line for your own project with connecting elsewhere without having to pay those network costs. Because we have an open access scheme, you would also face the risk that you pay a lot of money to build your point-to-point connection and then find that the certainty of your access to the market is still at risk of being undercut by others connecting around you. So you wouldn't be able to guarantee that you won't be curtailed or face losses in the future unless you really connected right into one of the load centers. And then the final point, I think, is also that we still have a lot of policy uncertainty. There's a lot of policy changes going on in the market, and it makes it quite a risky market in which to spend a lot of money investing in a large network project for your own generation asset. So I think that's probably the most important benefit of developing coordinated reses, is to ensure that we can actually build out the generation that we need. Some of the other benefits have overlap with the offshore wind. So things like minimizing the social, societal impacts of large transmission build by having coordinated approaches rather than a lot of parallel lines, minimizing land use issues. There are obviously the significant cost efficiencies of having a coordinated approach, as well as time and resource efficiencies. And there's an opportunity to provide some of the value and solve for some of the technical challenges at a scale. So one of the issues that we see in the network at the moment in areas with a lot of renewable build out is system strength. Low system strength issues are a real challenge, and they cause a lot of constraints. And building a new coordinated res or augmenting an existing res in a coordinated fashion provides an opportunity to address some of those challenges at scale, to meet the needs of a lot of connecting projects at once at a lower cost to consumers.
I think that, Jackie, just jumping in there, I think what's really interesting is that the parallels here, these could be exactly the same points that we make on the UK slide, right? So these benefits are completely are very much paralleled, and the one about minimizing land use and social impacts is one that is being considered extensively at the moment, because of the dynamics are slightly different, because what we're talking about here, no one cares so much about the offshore parts of the network to some extent, but where those onshore landing points are, there's certainly a lot of challenge around the number of connections that are going to be required to connect the volume of renewables in Europe or in the UK is going to require a lot of onshore substations on our relatively small coastline in some respects, in terms of where they could actually connect into the main transmission system. So I think there's some really interesting parallels for how, I suppose, in the Australia example, you've looked to try and coordinate that or solve that issue through coordination, which is maybe a kind of a potential outcome for in the UK as well. So I think it's really interesting to see how it's developed in the NEM.
Yeah,
Matt,
and
I'm also sensing. Sorry, Jackie, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say that I would say it's still a challenge, because I guess if we saw a lot of point-to-point connection lines from individual projects, you would have the challenge of a lot of lines creating challenges. I think on the flip side, the prospect of developing a very large, at-scale renewable energy zone is quite intimidating to local communities. It's not sort of one or two small solar projects that are trying to negotiate with landholders. It's the prospect of a very large multi-gigawatt project in a region. I think ultimately the coordinated approach is better and will be easier to work with communities and ensure that the benefits are shared across the project, but it will still be a challenge.
Yeah, I'm sensing Australia's, and Matt and Jackie, good to get your sense. I'm sensing Australia's slightly more on the central planning side versus the UK European approach, which seems to be a little bit more, let's facilitate a developer-led approach. Is that right? Am I interpreting that correctly? And B, is it a bit of a risk? There's two risks actually. One is, in the Australian approach, consumers end up picking up the bill for some bad decisions by government from a planning perspective, or by the transmission companies. And in the European approach, that nothing gets coordinated. Thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. So it is your assessment of the situation was correct. We don't really see a developer-led approach very often to the large transmission connections. And that is partly driven just by the access scheme and sort of the policy settings around network investment here. There's the chance that you would spend a lot of money building your transmission connection for your particular project, and then find that all of the benefits that you've just invested in are sort of undercut by others. There's no exclusive rights to connect into the network. And so it's kind of a free rider challenge that I think prevents people from sort of going the developer-led approach, which isn't to say that we're not going to see it. And there are a number of private res style development projects that are sort of in the works at the moment. And I am wondering if it's something that we'll see more of as the scale of the renewable energy projects increases, because as we move towards the prospects of potentially gigawatt size onshore solar and wind projects, in fact, it would only take the coordination of maybe 2 or 3 private parties to actually have quite a significant scale to then co-fund a developer-led connection. But I think when we do see that happening, it will be very strategically located so that they can connect themselves into a very sizable part of the existing transmission line and reduce the risk of being undercut by someone else. Yeah.
Matt, your thoughts?
Yeah, I again, I think yes. So I think on the European and UK side, absolutely right. It's been developer led. That's the policy ambition has been for parties to come forward with coordinated solutions. We are at a point where I think there's a decision to be made as to whether that is going to deliver the level of infrastructure needed to meet some of these targets that we've been talking about. I think maybe the question for me is whether it's all or nothing. So, there are clearly kind of stepping stones toward a fully, top-down coordinated solution, which might be, more regional coordination offshore, coordination amongst a number of different parties, but not trying to solve the whole of the North Sea in one go. Because I think that's clearly a big step away from where we are at the moment. I mean, it is fair to say that other European countries follow the Australian route, where they build the network, and generation then connects at a point in time in the future, which is it's not uncommon in Europe. I suppose it's just a bit uncommon in the kind of UK offshore sense. So I think you're right, and it'll be interesting to see the outcome of the kind of policy review as to where that kind of governance role lies in terms of, will there be an offshore system operator? Will there be an offshore kind of separate offshore regulation? All those questions are very much live at the moment.
Great. So let's move into Q&A. And then we've already started it, so that's great. Let's get into it and see. I've got a few more questions, but let's definitely open up to the audience and see if there's any questions. Give everybody a few seconds. Either take yourself off mute or post it in the chat. Very happy if we do either one of those.
Can I kick off with a question for Matt, actually?
Oh, yeah, great.
Yeah, so I think here we've had a lot of discussion around the build and they will come approach to res network development, and it's looking like it's probably the most efficient way to be developing reses. So to build the transmission network to scale on the assumption that the generators will connect down the track. Do you see that? And here I think there's still a lot of concern about the risk of asset stranding if the generators don't connect. But you have CFDs to support offshore wind. Do you think that there is a risk that generators wouldn't connect, or would you imagine it's quite certain that if you built a scaled network sort of connection out into an area of the sea with strong wind resources that they would connect?
So it's a good question. I mean, I think you're right that the incentive around the CFD and the kind of the connection timelines associated with the point in time, once you've got a CFD contract, you're contractually committed to delivering power at a certain point in time, does provide a strong incentive to stick around. I suppose taking it back a step, I think the challenge is almost prior to that, whether a CFD, how would an offshore wind party, with a CFD, would they kind of feel comfortable or take on the risk associated with someone else building and developing that infrastructure, where historically it's all been done, offshore wind has been developed. The OFTO regime has developed through the generator build model, where the generator offshore builds its connection and then it's divested and sold. And that the reason that has sustained as the model is because that means that the risk is in the developers gift until the point of sale. So they're better able to manage that. The other route for offshore wind would be a kind of OFTO-led model where the generator identifies a connection and then very early on in the process the transmission assets are tendered and someone goes away, designs, builds, owns and operates them. But that model hasn't really delivered any network infrastructure yet for many reasons, but one of them being because the generator is giving up quite a lot of the it can give that risk back to somebody else to build its connection. So I suppose the question might come back to, it depends who and under what framework is the network being built. If the network's already there, if it's being built well ahead of need, then I think the question falls away a little bit, because the risk is reduced or transferred. But I agree with your kind of initial point that the CFD, because it is such a strong incentive mechanism, and there are CFD around AR4 and 5 are kind of coming up in the next few years. They do provide a strong signal for investment and a strong kind of return for generators.
Really good. I've got a question around anticipatory investment and developer appetite in Europe, Matt, for investing in advance of their own future projects. Thinking about Dogger Bank or the Baltics area, or even Germany, which is more TSO led, right? As we know.
Yeah.
What's the desire for anticipatory investment, and you think it'll happen?
Yeah, so I think it's part of that kind of bucket of policy that's been thought about for a long time. There have been pockets of very small anticipatory investment for offshore wind over the past few years, but nothing major, no significant scale of expanding your network or allowing a future connection for an offshore wind farm. And that's probably because of the lack of kind of certainty or clarity on the transfer of who's taking on that risk. So working through the process for anticipatory investment to work, I suppose developers and regulators in the OFTO sense need to get comfortable with the fact that you are building ahead of need, but that need will materialise, which kind of goes to Jackie's point. And I think that is a bit of a leap of faith in some ways, and there hasn't been the perfect project that's kind of met the criteria that would facilitate that. So I think it is one of the big challenges across this whole topic is the role of anticipatory investment, and whether there were going to be sufficiently strong incentives for people to be able to commit to investment, whether regulators and governments can make decisions to sign that off effectively ahead of need based on future projections and expectations, and whether that ultimately will materialise and allow for the coordination that we're seeing. Because I think it's fair to say that without some anticipatory investment, we're not going to get the kind of big bang coordinated networks offshore that we're kind of talking about, and where these real benefits materialise. The risk is that we ended up with kind of piecemeal additions to an existing network, which develop on a more radial basis, which doesn't quite get there in terms of a coordinated solution.
Good. Questions from others, from listeners in? Please just feel free to take yourself off mute and just go ahead. Happy to take any questions.
Hi, Lash. It's Ed Burkett here. I've got a question.
Mr. Burkett.
How are you? Is there a role for governments to give regulators more political cover to take these sort of anticipatory investments and to take more risk on behalf of customers?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I suppose it comes back to my previous point that is that going to be a facilitator of making this all happen? Does somebody? I think it's fair to say that somebody needs to kind of take some decisions to allow for this coordination, whether it's a direct regulatory decision, whether it's kind of deferred through the system operator, or a new kind of party that is responsible for, I suppose, planning in a more committed sense, and not just a kind of top-down plan, but a kind of binding plan for offshore networks. I think it comes back to Ed, the point around we can't do it all in one go, but are there stepping stones onto that the regulators, through, for example, the cost assessment process, are able to kind of take a call that allows parties to invest with some comfort that the risk will be transferred across to consumers, regardless of the ultimate generation outcome. And ideally, those things align, right? And the CFD incentives provide the strong incentives for connection. The regulatory arrangements transfer that risk in an appropriate way between developers and consumers. There's some kind of sharing of pain or gain on there as well, which could allow. But I think the regulator's role offshore is going to be one that is a key theme of the kind of policy incentive review for offshore networks over the next few months.
And if I can,
Australian approach. Sorry, Jackie. Go ahead. Go.
I was just going to say that here, and I spoke too slowly and didn't get to this in my slides, so apologies. But here, one of the key roles of the integrated system plan, so the sort of central plan, is to try and help to overcome one of those challenges. So traditionally, if you're seeking investment for a regulated transmission asset, so a piece of large transmission build out, you would need to demonstrate the market benefit based on committed generation only. So if you're looking to develop ahead of the generation, it would not be possible to demonstrate the benefit of your project. And it's a chicken and egg situation that meant that it wasn't possible to do that anticipatory build of renewable energy zones. And since developing the central plan, the market bodies have tried to change the regulation and change the way that that transmission investment test runs, so that if the central plan has said that there'll be a renewable energy zone in a particular area of a particular capacity, so a particular size, then when you're trying to demonstrate the market benefits of building that network, you can use that as your assumption and use that to sort of underpin the market benefits case of the project. So that hasn't actually been demonstrated yet. It's a recent change. But the intention is that using the central plan as a basis, you should be able to sort of overcome the chicken and egg situation and have that network build out as a sort of build and they will come approach. And that does transfer the risk to consumers, but it's based on sort of a whole of system plan.
Yeah, I think there's a risk in that, with my conclusion, Ed. I think there's a risk in the Australian approach where essentially it's government mandated, government planned. I think there's a risk in the European approach of leave it to developers. My own instinct says I think there will be sufficient self-interest in developers, particularly in Europe, to coordinate, at least for offshore to offshore coordination. And we should get government and allow government and regulation to facilitate that without directing it. That'll be my instinct. But I think there are challenges and risks in both approaches. And we just need to be a little bit careful about underwriting investments that are then supported through some other government instrument, either CFDs or certificates.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
We are roughly running out of time. So there's a great comment on the chat around the risk of the open access regime and the red zones in Australia. I think have a look at that. I think that's absolutely right. I think I'd agree with that. Matt and Jackie, one quick question for me. Your best guess of the number of coordinated offshore transmission projects or RES projects which will be actually built in the next decade? Matt, maybe Jackie, you first. How many RES projects will actually get built out versus planned for?
There are pretty tight commitments in some of the states here, actually. The state that I'm in now has a commitment for certain capacities in 3 RESs and the potential to build out 5 by the end of the decade. I think Victoria has 6, so I think we'd be looking in Australia at least probably 15 would be my guess.
15, great guess. All right, Matt, you? What were you
I'd go for 3. I think the offshore nature of some of these projects make them slightly adds complexity, and I think Brexit has thrown a bit of a spanner in the works. So, which we all knew about, but it's maybe a bigger spanner than we first thought. So I think 2 or 3 could be great, but with a plan to deliver more by 2040 and beyond.
So jam tomorrow, Matt, is what you're saying. But
exactly.
Excellent, really good. Well, thank you both. Thank you for everybody for joining. Really enjoyable, fantastic to see so many industry colleagues and clients on the webinar today. Please do get in touch with myself, Matt or Jackie, with any or with the Bringer team here if you've got further questions, want to follow up on areas of interest, and you want to talk about some of the work we're doing in the space. The next seminar will be on the 10th of June, where Natasha Patel and I will be talking to a number of clients. I think we're just finalising the client list for that, around fleet EVs, which is going to be really interesting. I think that's a really important topic and one that is getting a lot of traction, and some of the barriers and economics for fleet owners to transition to electric. So to that one. So hopefully see a lot of you there.